with our LEX Talks Part 2. And emceeing that portion of our LEX Talks will be Tony Lai. Tony is a Codex Fellow and a force of nature who has started many important projects, also co-founder of legal.io. At Codex, he's currently focusing much of his energy on our blockchain group, which is very active at doing tremendous work. And Tony, we're excited to have you MC our LEX Talks Part 2. Over to you.
Thanks, Roland. Welcome, Codex friends, to the second round of LEX Talks at Codex FutureLaw 2021, where we are tapping the well springs of law, education, and experience to quench our collective thirst for knowledge and inspiration. I'm delighted to be introducing today the creators and stewards of 4 innovative projects that offer insights and perspectives on the future of law, here to inspire with their experiences and their learnings on the potential for access, inclusion, and impact when the study of law is expanded to co-creation and collaboration on future-oriented projects. While we heard in our first round of LEX Talks how computational law is being applied in areas from antitrust to legal APIs and supporting well-aligned and explainable uses of AI, our next 4 talks will be addressing the use of computational law in immigration, public health, legal research, and government relations management. All 4 of these projects will discuss data governance and privacy in various ways. Data governance in immigration as part of an accessible design to enhance access to justice while ensuring security around sensitive information, I'm sure. Data governance as part of the Codex Corona Atlas project, balancing access to information, especially for vulnerable populations, with work on data standards in law, policy, and public health to ensure that relevant resources are free, well-organized, and readily available. Data governance in the use of disposable neural nets in legal research and beyond, and data governance to put control back into the hands of the public when transacting with local, state, and national governments. It seems to me that computational law and the legal engineers and other professionals who apply it to help build solutions based on ethical approaches to data governance will be essential to the future of law and the future of policy, society, and how we coordinate and build trust within one another in any area of life. Now, in speaking about trust, data governance, and the future of law, I'd like to take a moment to briefly describe the work of the blockchain group that Roland mentioned, which I help organize here at Codex, and where we focus on this intersection of these new technologies with law and policy. So whether we're talking about blockchain, the decentralized web, or distributed ledger technologies, our goals are to research and publish, track and guide policy coordination, and to be an inclusive, neutral learning and discussion forum. To borrow some of the phrasing from the earlier computational contracts discussion, these are, in a sense, networked ecosystems of computational contracting. We might see them as applied examples of recurring logic within and interoperability between these ecosystems. And as Codex Fellows, we set up and steward a range of group projects to help build capacity in these ecosystems. Following today's FutureLaw conference, you'll find a range of recently recorded panels and discussions coordinated by our group and available under a related content tab on the main FutureLaw website. The Stanford Climate Data Policy Initiative is hosting a discussion on driving global carbon emissions reductions with data policy innovations. And with our other group projects, we hosted a series of discussions on blockchain law and policy, covering US and global regulations, decentralized dispute resolution, decentralized finance, and much more. It's thanks to a whole ecosystem of interdisciplinary contributors and collaborators that this work is made possible. Work, to quote from Kristen earlier, that can serve and empower diverse communities in a scalable way like never before. Thank you also to Roland, Mike, Susan, and the whole Codex team for seeding and nurturing these spaces for us all to share and grow in this spirit of friendship and co-learning. And so now to our first of 4 LEX Talks. LEX Talk speakers who are here to share with us today. Amélie-Sophie Vavrovski is the founder of Formally, a legal tech startup that uses accessible design to simplify and streamline immigration applications. Formally's innovative software has been celebrated for its accessibility, security, and thoughtful data privacy practices. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Amélie leveraged her expertise in remote legal assistance to provide legal counsel to refugees and asylum seekers at the US-Mexican border. And in January this year, she organized a conference in collaboration with the Stanford Digital Civil Society Lab on the topic of remote legal aid. As the lead graduate researcher at the Stanford Digital Civil Society Lab, She manages projects on the right to freedom of assembly and association in digital spaces, anti-surveillance, and digital capacity building for nonprofit organizations. Amélie, I'm absolutely fascinated by this notion of accessible design being used to support access to justice and fairness in a digital age. You've also been working on digital human rights in both international and domestic jurisdictions and seeking to bridge the gap between public and private sectors. This is all so interesting. For now, though, Amélie, we're excited to hear what you have to share on your experiences with computational law and innovation in immigration. So, Amélie, welcome. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for hosting us, Tony and Roland. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here. My name is Amélie Vavrovski. I'm the founder and CEO at Formally, and today I will be talking about Formally. And first of all, I'd like to actually share with you why innovation needs to happen in the immigration space specifically. So Formally is a software company that seeks to make immigration applications more accessible by streamlining them for both applicants and also attorneys. So we're trying to really reimagine the way access to justice works for people seeking immigration help. And why do we do this, right? So if you're an asylum seeker in the US right now, and you come to the US-Mexican border, you are given a form called the I-589. So that's the application for asylum and for withholding of removal. So this form only exists in English currently. So let's just take a look at the very first question of this form. Actually, let's look at the first question on that page. So it asks you to check this box if you also want to apply for withholding of removal under the Convention Against Torture. No need to say that this is a really complicated question, and even for somebody like me who studies international law, not trivial to answer, but let's see if it gets better. The next question asks about your alien registration number, then your US Social Security number, and your US CIS online account number, none of which you are likely to have if you're applying for asylum in the US. So where can asylum seekers turn for help with these complex immigration applications? There are some really wonderful law firms and lawyers and non-governmental organizations that really seek to help people with these applications and to represent them in court. Unfortunately, they're severely overworked. They also don't always speak all the languages necessary to help everybody. They're especially lacking in translators for indigenous languages. And lastly, they often lack funding and cannot help everybody. And all of these problems combined mean that in the US, about 86% of asylum seekers do not have legal representation when they're applying for asylum in the US. It's worth noting here that in the US, as opposed to some other places in the world, you are not guaranteed an attorney if you're seeking asylum in the US, even if you're a child. And not having an attorney makes you an estimated 5 times more likely to be denied if you're seeking asylum, regardless of how valid your case is. So this is really sort of the problem field that inspired me to build Formally. So Formally streamlines immigration applications by providing translations, context for difficult questions, and by also allowing attorneys to outsource the form filling process to the applicant. So by making these forms really accessible for applicants, attorneys actually get presented with really, really good drafts of applications and spend a lot less time on applications, but I'll talk more about that later. So one question that illustrates what Formally does for an applicant is this question number 24 on the form. So it asks you an innocuous question. It asks you, are you fluent in English? But what the implication here is that if you cross yes for this question, you're actually giving up your right to have an interpreter present during your court proceedings. So Formally is not able to give legal advice, but it can give you the context of why it is really important that you answer this question truthfully. And for those who aren't fluent in English, we offer many translations, including Arabic, Spanish, and Mandarin. So when a legal aid organization works with an applicant to complete an I-589, it can take anywhere from 4 hours to sometimes a couple of days to just complete a single form. And that does not actually include forms for dependents, like spouses and dependent children. With Formally, we were able to reduce attorneys' time spent on applications to a single hour. And that leaves more time for advocacy, more time for accompanying clients to court, and less time spent on bureaucracy, which is what attorneys have repeatedly told us, not the part of their work that they enjoy the most or that provides the deepest level of connection and effect. And most importantly, for applicants, they gain agency, right? So understanding the questions of the asylum applications better having read through them and filled them out in their native language, having gotten the context, they come in much better prepared, they ask better questions, and they feel much more ownership over their own case. And Formally actually goes beyond that. So after individuals complete their asylum applications, all their data and their supporting documents are securely stored in our cloud software, and all the information can be used to pre-populate any subsequent application. So most of the time, applicants have to fill out employment authorizations, change of address forms, and the list continues. So we expect Formally to become sort of like a securely encrypted digital passport for people as they navigate a new bureaucratic system. And the way this works is that we're a B2B SaaS company, so we work with legal aid organizations. We have a SaaS subscription model, and they provide free access codes to Formally to applicants. And in that way, we never have to charge end users, but we can provide a high quality, securely encrypted product to people. And the way we do this is that the way we handle security. So my research focuses a lot on anti-surveillance and security. So we're a web app, and we use the best encryption like on an end-to-end level throughout our product. And like I said, the goal is to really equip people with their own data and make it their own again, right? So right now, if you work with a law firm, usually case management software, you don't really have access to case management software. But the idea behind Formally is that your account is actually completely your own, and you can use it after working with a legal aid organization to navigate any subsequent legal process. And that's as much a presentation as I have prepared for today, but I would love to actually engage in a discussion and get some questions and answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Amélie, so much. I encourage our audience to submit questions through the Q&A section. But until then, I have a few questions myself. Fantastic work, by the way. It's incredibly hard to weave together that balance of simply designed, technically secure product with some of the potential complexities involved, as you're saying, weaving that fine line between not giving legal advice, but also providing contextual information is such an interesting UI challenge. Have you seen any particular hurdles or challenges to the way that you're going about that design? Have there been any pushbacks in terms of potentially going too far one way or the other?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting space, as you mentioned, and I think what we actually expected to be the largest UI challenge was designing for people who are not fluent in English and who are not tech literate beyond WhatsApp, right? So the level of tech literacy that we design at is, can somebody use WhatsApp, right? So if your grandma can use WhatsApp to send you a message in the family group chat, they should also be able to use Formally. So this is a completely new notion in the legal field. Most case management software needs to be learned, and there is actually training programs to learn them. And attorneys were skeptical, right? So, and Formally doesn't cut out attorneys, right? So Formally is really a tool for legal aid organizations and tries to keep them in the loop, but it is not meant to replace attorneys by any means. And I think that's a really important notion, right? It's just, instead of saying, let's have a DIY software, which is, I think, the approach this legal tech scene has taken, is like, why don't we just let people DIY it? Keeping attorneys in the loop was really challenging. But we found that attorneys were more skeptical and applicants were actually much more able to use the software than expected. So we were really positively surprised. So when applicants came in with like fully drafted applications that they had just chiseled away one question at a time, attorneys were really surprised. And most law groups at the beginning did not want to give Formally to people individually. Instead, they had paralegals fill it out, but I think that shift is slowly happening. So the skepticism actually came from the legal aid organizations, and we were actually able to prove accessibility and usability for our end users, which was really exciting for us.
Fascinating. We've got a few questions coming in, but I want to ask one last question, just because this is something that I've heard a lot about in the context of knowing someone called Bonnie Hoff, who she was a speaker previously at FutureLaw, and she is responsible for the self-help centers in California. And so I know that there is a burgeoning sort of institutional support structure of the justice system. Have you found much working with those groups?
Yeah, so we are getting requests increasingly from other organizations outside the immigration space, right? And I think that's absolutely something that is within the scope of our work, right? We started sort of in one space, we started in the asylum space, but the way I imagine Formally is really in this more digital passport sort of way that allows you to navigate any bureaucratic barrier. And that is because of my background in policy. So I'm a policymaker by training, and I understand systematic oppression, and I understand how bureaucratic systems that are not designed to have people succeed, right? So if it's really difficult to get food stamps, the people who really need them are likely the ones who cannot access them. So if we can change accessibility just through taking down bureaucratic barriers, I think that could be huge. So yeah, we've gotten requests from like DMV forms to healthcare, but I'm really excited about potential partnerships with cities and local governments, and to have formally available sort of through like a government level to people, so that they can, yeah, be the owners of their own data, right? That's actually the biggest thing of formally, like it's not, your data isn't sitting somewhere with an attorney and you don't know what's going on. Like you have all your documents in an actually encrypted server. And I think that excites me. And that's why this intersection with the Digital Civil Society Lab really works out for the product design.
Amélie, you've been inundated with questions since we started. I'm going to be able to ask one for you, but if you wouldn't mind going in and responding to them in the Q&A later, that would be wonderful. I'm going to ask the question about interacting with other lawyer for existing form software. Is that something that you are able to do or have been looking at in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think the way Formally works is really, it can replace case management software at some organizations, right? But it really depends on the process. Formally can also be used in addition. So we don't hoard any data. Again, I have training in like good data practices. So you can download all your data in a like PDF bundle. You can download as a CSV file. So it integrates with other systems, but it takes a little bit of a different approach, right? So instead of having a really long paper trail with like version 1, version 2, version 3, the applicant actually always has the newest version because the attorney drops into their account and does it, like makes edits directly in their account. So when a client requests review, the attorney actually goes into their account, leaves notes, makes changes, right? So there is really no need for this version control. We're trying to rethink the way it works and make it more like a collaborative tool. But yeah, I think it works both in conjunction with existing systems, right? To host virtual clinics or to do pro bono projects for large law firms. But at some legal aid organizations, I think it can absolutely replace case management software as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. Amélie, well, thank you so much for the time. I'm afraid we're going to have to move on to our next speaker now, but would love to continue the conversation, and I'm sure many others would as well. So thank you again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'll go into the Q&A and answer some more questions.
Wonderful. So our next speaker, Stephen Caines, is a residential fellow at Codex and a legal technologist with a passion for privacy and access to justice. His work primarily focuses on facial recognition use by governments and law enforcement, as well as examining the impacts of other emerging technologies. Stephen is a co-founder of the Corona Atlas dashboard, which he'll be talking about today, a free pandemic resource open to the general public, and currently serves on the San Jose Digital Privacy Advisory Task Force. Stephen, the challenge of coordinating information and data in privacy sensitive ways to support collective needs like public health, it's such a fascinating challenge in terms of governance of a data commons. So thank you for joining us today to share all of your best practices and learning from the Codex Corona Atlas project.
Absolutely, and thank you for that introduction, Tony. Thank you so much to the entire Codex staff for putting together this event. As he's previously said, my name is Stephen Caines. I'm the current residential fellow for Codex. Just as a little roadmap of where I'm going to go today, I'm going to just elaborate a little bit more about who I am. I'm going to discuss the original motivations for this project and the key functionality in the first MVP. Then we'll move on to the decision to pivot. We'll show this a brief current version of the project, and then I'll just finish up with some lessons learned. So I've been a residential fellow here at Codex since 2019. I really can't say enough good things, and I would definitely run over my time if I did, but this is truly a unique community of just innovators and movers that just really just energize you in a way that I haven't found in other spaces. So I truly love Codex. As Tony mentioned, my main focus though is on facial recognition and government use of surveillance technology. I also serve on the San Jose Digital Privacy Advisory Task Force, and I'm also in the Day One Project Technology Policy Accelerator. So I'm currently learning how to draft federal policy in 9 weeks, which is a great experience. I also help with some Codex courses like a boot camp that we run every year that I co-organize with Jay Mandal and Dan Lina, and also Roland as well. And then also I'm happy to announce that I was just offered and accepted an offer rather with the San Jose Mayor's Office of Technology and Innovation as a technology and policy innovation advisor. So I'll start that position on a part-time basis later this month, but really excited to be working at kind of the local municipal level. So how did this project start? In March 2020, just when paper towel was running out, but we were starting to feel that something serious was coming. My sister sent this message to my family in a group chat. And so this picture is of my sister. She's a physician at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit. And she was on the front lines in a sense because she was asked to run a COVID unit. And so just hearing what she's going through every day, realizing the risk, as her brother, not only what her patients were going through, but also her colleagues, and realizing that there's millions of other frontline workers out there really kind of taking a huge personal risk to kind of ensure safety for the rest of us. I really just came down to one question, and that was, how can I help? And while I lack any kind of formal medical training, I do kind of have some experience in access to justice. And I recognize that while this was primarily a health crisis that created an economic crisis, it was also a crisis of information, both in terms of access and people also being able to trust where that information was coming from, as things were kind of beginning to get a little bit more polarized in all senses of the phrase. And so I was really motivated to kind of find a way that I could use my current knowledge. And so, as I mentioned, I have experience with ATJ and working with nonprofits, and also a little bit of experience with disaster preparedness. So I could kind of guess what people need, and I was seeing the gap between the information that people had at their fingers and what they actually wanted and needed to know. So just to briefly overlay, what are the problems with public health orders in the viewpoint of last spring? We have a lack of centralization. The information spread over thousands of websites, huge volume of data. Miami-Dade County specifically had 75 orders just as that June, and it clearly expanded since then. You also have issues of preemption where normally you would assume that, if a county enacts it, then the city has to comply. We saw things like in Texas where the governor in certain counties and cities were actually at odds over things like mask orders and should they have fines. So kind of these traditional notions of preemption and jurisdiction are being challenged in multiple levels. And then you also have issues of public legal literacy. The county can put out a 7-page document, but the amount of people that can read it, probably directly correlates to the amount of people with formal legal training, unfortunately. And then also you have the issue of non-standard data, which is something that's been, raised in other contexts earlier in this conference before. So I reached out to a good friend of mine named Daniel Carvajal, who currently lives in Orlando, Florida. And I know him just because we went to undergrad together, but he has a wide plethora of other interests, including web development and audio engineering, and then also some machine learning experience as well. But essentially, he built the website from scratch in terms of like building off a React.js platform, and then I curated all of the legal information. And in the first run, in our first MVP, which you see here, I actually hand-coded about 500 pieces of legislation myself. And as I mentioned, Daniel built the site. At this 1.0 version, you could select specifically state, county, city level, and then you would see the results populated here. And then you could also search by different filters. We also had a section just full of like longer form content where people could like read and also take action in the form of signing petitions, donating money, and et cetera. This here is just a screenshot of like in 1.0, when you enter, let's say Florida, you'd see city, statewide ordinances, and county. One thing that we quickly realized from user testing is that people would remember to enter their city, but not remember necessarily the county. So we had to like work in that logic of, if you select, let's say Miami, you also get a county, and also Florida. So you see everything that's relevant to you as well. And the reason why we have 2 icons here is because we realized that people wanted the same information for different reasons. So the little government icon, when you click on it, it goes to the actual government document. The little link button, that actually goes to a news story. And so really, instead of just cataloging, let's say, one document, we called them like historical events, essentially. So, we wanted to have multiple ways that people could kind of interpret this data. That was something that we were really focused on. So what type of things were we collecting? This is, at least at the first one, this was the categories of information that we're collecting. I won't read them all just for time's sake, but shelter in place, stay at home, evictions, health, curfew, travel, social distancing. And all of this, I just want to make clear, like we offer this all completely like free to the public. This was something that, one from an IP standpoint, you can't really claim anything on, let's say, public government documents, but also we felt that this was something that should just be expedited to the public. And like, given that, we all pay so many taxes, this is something from at least a data governance perspective, we felt should honestly be offered to just general citizens and their like independent just jurisdictions. So just to give you an idea also of like what these orders look like, this is just the top heading of one. This is a this is an Orange County order specifically about reopening and requiring social distancing. This is one from Texas, specifically an amendment to an existing health order. So that was the other issue. Some of the orders were building off of each other through amendments, not just being issued as new kind of pieces of legislation in that regard. And then the different things that we're extracting, when I use the phrase hand coding, we extracted just different dates, right? So there was like the date that it was signed, there was a date that it was effective. Sometimes there was a grace period in which it went in. Sometimes there was like an enforcement period as well that differed. We also had that multi-tier jurisdictional elements that I commented on before, and also amendments, and also just different people signing it. Sometimes they were county judges, sometimes they were public health officials, sometimes they were mayors. It was very interesting to see the amount of people that were interacting and creating this legislation. And so what was the original vision of this 1.0 MVP, right? What we were originally trying to go for is at a very basic level, telling people what public health orders were active and where, and to whom they applied to, right? So on a basic level 1. Level 2, just from my past work in public interest, I know that some of these ordinances, especially with fines and things, that can often have disparate impacts on certain communities. But for me to even kind of empirically prove that, I would need to get all the orders that have fines incorporated with them. So I wanted to enable legislative analysis for disparate impacts. And then a kind of a level 3 ability, though, I wanted to allow people from outside of the field to be able to interact with this data, kind of addressing some of the public literacy issues that I mentioned before. And the way that we envisioned achieving this was essentially having law students across the country essentially analyzing their own local ordinances and documents, right? And then essentially also having an NLP algorithm running back to back, kind of labeling it. And the reason why I thought that that would succeed is for 2 reasons. One, you can't necessarily trust like a layperson to label this data in a sense, like and get a high accuracy necessarily, but it's also something that's a little bit rote where you wouldn't ask an attorney to do this unless you had the money to pay them. And even so, like even something like document review might be slightly more entertaining than that. And then these were kind of the issues that we were thinking of. And then separately, as we all know with NLP, some of the applications with, let's say, social media, where things are a lot more nuanced, it's difficult to have kind of a high functioning system. But things like legislative ordinances, they're a little bit straightforward, although there are certain jurisdictional phrases and terms that are used, for the most part, is relatively straightforward. And so that was kind of the original vision that we had. And unfortunately, we weren't able to get there, so we made a decision to pivot. So just to talk about exactly what led up to that, right? The first was we recognized that most likely there was a new administration coming at this point. We were like entering the fall towards the summer. We realized that a lot of these issues were caused because there was no central command structure essentially that was dictating exactly how the entire country would move. So we were a little bit optimistic that a new administration would come in and kind of straighten things out. Second, we had some funding challenges back in last summer. A lot of the money was going toward direct client services. It was going towards funding a vaccine and also things like contact tracing. And so while information infrastructure is very important, I think it's something that unless you have a certain life experience, it may not be like apparently very clear as to why this is such a vital need. Third, we also had competition from other places like Bloomberg that just, you know, point blank had more money and resources in their hands to kind of work on this project. We had evolving societal interests. We saw like a lot of friction with people complying with health orders in a sense, and also reluctance sometimes, both on the part of law enforcement and elected officials to also enforce them. And then also just overall changing priorities. I realized that, you know, with the advent of a lot more of health surveillance technologies, maybe going back to the facial recognition grind in a sense would also yield more benefits in terms of the most good that I could offer. And Daniel also had a number of projects that he was also interested in. So this is the site as it is today, as I aptly call Corona Atlas 2.0. In addition to giving it just a facelift and kind of a better UI UX design, instead of having 500 hand-coded documents, we started scraping. So that was a project of Daniel specifically. So you'll see scraped documents here. We had a health API connecting here, essentially giving health data. And then the main new thing that we added though, was I also manually created about 2,500 state-specific links. So these are everything from elections, employment, education, housing, travels, because there were a lot of restrictions, immigration. And then the most recent thing that we added recently was actually vaccination information. So if anybody's looking to get vaccinated, head over to the site, you'll see things about who's eligible in your state right now, exactly where you can get logged on, where you can sign up for appointments with Spotter, and then also just statistics on, you know, who's been vaccinated or infrequently asked questions just based on your state. So that was the most recent component that we added. And here I'm just summarizing some of the differences. We went from manual creation to automatically scraping, multi-page, single page, just in terms of like the tabs we use. We hosted it on law.stanford.edu as we were able to make this an official Stanford project last summer. So we were very excited about that. And then also we more so focused when we were scraping on state legislation, just kind of addressing some of those issues previously. And the original site only had 40 kind of resources, and the new one has about 2,500. And the multi-party audience comment was more about we're really aiming to get policymakers and kind of a wide variety of stakeholders using this in the original instance, but we decided to really narrow and pivot due to just kind of time constraints. So this is more for just a general public. And then also, I'd be remiss to note that we also had our research director of Codex, Michael Genezos, join us as a principal investigator of the project, who really provided invaluable kind of advice on how to go about this project and even the decision to pivot in a sense. So forever grateful to Mike for being able to advise this project and bring it to a state where it provides a benefit. So now, just to quickly move to lessons learned. On a personal note, what was really fascinating to me was knowing when to expand and also constrain your scope. One example would be when we had originally curfews that were enacted for health purposes. After the George Floyd protests, there were curfews enacted, and there was a serious discussion as to whether we should include that in the site or not, given that it wasn't necessarily public health in the traditional sense of the virus, but it was more so public health in terms of just, I guess, or not so public health, it was more so publicly mandated action. So therefore you're complied to follow it in a sense. So we decided to include it. Also just really learned a lot of project management skills, the value of asynchronous work as we were working on 2 different coasts with Daniel in Florida and me in California. I learned that grant writing is an art in a sense, and something that definitely needs to be worked on over years in a sense. And also the decision of when to pivot. I find that too often we're very married to our ideas, and it's hard to know when to kind of fold in a sense and move on to the next project. But I think going through this has really opened my eyes as to when you've invested enough energy and when to make the right course change in a sense. And then finally, also, if nothing else, I'd like to just really hone in on the notion of there needs to be a legislative autopsy of what happened last year. And when I speak on that, I know it's kind of hard to revisit a lot of those times in a sense of isolation, things like that. But my essential thesis is that we can now connect legislative orders with public health outcomes to other sources of data aside from just the increase of cases. So one example I've used is if you're wondering if a mask ordinance was effective in terms of compliance, you might be able to do something like taking a random sample sizing of, let's say, surveillance video in a highly populated area. If you're trying to determine if a stay-at-home order actually worked, you might be able to use Google mobility data from that time point to see if people complied, and see if different constructions of legislation actually made a difference in those health outcomes. So for instance, does having a grace period actually increase compliance, or is it better to just sign something to make it effective immediately? Those are the types of questions that I would still like to explore, and I think that there's a wealth of information that we would be really remiss as a society to kind of just glance over. Second, information infrastructure is vital, and to me almost as vital as getting vaccines in people's arms in a sense, in the notion that there's so much distrust and confusion that was generated at the beginning of the pandemic. It really hurt how people responded and whether they complied to public health orders. And I think that if we had more robust and kind of sturdy information infrastructure, then we would be able to essentially close a lot of those gaps, increase public trust and compliance. Laws are only as good as their enforcement, just relates to kind of those issues around mask ordinances that I issued before, or just before. Designed for everyday people as a final note, or second to final note, simply because a lot of our great conversations are experts talking to experts, but remember to kind of help the small people. And the Amelie's project also does that as well. And then finally, uplift the work of similar people trying to solve these issues. A lot of the resources that we actually included in the section were created by other institutions that had done amazing work, and we really wanted to shine a spotlight on that. So those are essentially the lessons learned. I hope I'm welcome to questions and comments. The website is coronatlas.law.stanford.edu. And then here also is my personal website, Twitter, and email.
Wow, thank you so much, Stephen. First off, congratulations on the new role. That sounds like a role made in heaven for you in terms of implementing some of these best practices and challenges, learning from those challenges. I mean, it's really, really nice when somebody talks about their decisions to pivot, because it's sometimes so hard. It can be a matter of pride, but when it comes to these public interest projects, lessons learned just mean it's going to happen better in the wider ecosystem. So I'm going to ask you to answer any questions in the chat because we're running short on time. So I'm going to move on to our next speaker. But thank you so much again, Stephen. Really enjoyed that presentation.
Absolutely, thank you.
Pablo Arredondo. Wow, what to say about Pablo? He's a rock of the community. He's been generous to a T. He was around when I first came to Stanford in 2010. And his work is wide, and he's intellectually such a gentleman. He focuses on civil litigation in common law jurisdictions with an emphasis on how litigators access and assemble the law. He's a graduate of Stanford Law School and of UC Berkeley. And before coming to Stanford, he worked for a year at the Center for Bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, focusing on the legal aspects of the genetic modification of organisms by corporations. Pablo is a member of the New York and California Bar, and he has represented leading technology companies in patent litigation at both the district court and appellate level. And today, Pablo is here to share more about research and why neural nets are the new yellow legal pads. Pablo, welcome.
All
Really
right, thank you,
this.
Tony, for that kind introduction. And thank you to everyone who put this conference together, including our sponsors. As always, it's a privilege to get to talk to this community. My coworkers did insist that I say that my current haircut does not represent the views of Casetext. This is my own personal situation. I'm here today to talk to you about an extension of work that we've been doing at Casetext, where our focus is building tools to help litigators do their job. I'm going to share my screen. And the way I'd like to talk about it is to just trace the evolution of this product line. And really it begins with some fundamental breakthroughs in the field of natural language processing made at Google by a gentleman named Jacob Devlin and his colleagues. I have never met Mr. Devlin, but I thank him in my mind every day, because the breakthroughs that they did and allowed a much richer way to capture language and a much richer model of language, which essentially, to my mind, has freed all who use it from the keyword of the prison of the keyword. And what I mean by that is all searching that was done prior to these breakthroughs, you were always at the mercy of the words that you chose. And so lawyers evolved fancy ways and long Boolean queries to try to do their best in that prison, but the results were always wanting. And years back, something was released. I think our sponsors, Thomson Reuters, LEX, something called natural language search. But that was really just casual Fridays in the prison of the keyword, right? Although you could be a little bit more informal with your query, at the end of the day, you were at the mercy of the words you chose. And that was because what you were searching on the back end was essentially a very flat, now when you think of it compared to what's here now, sort of dismal keyword index, a spreadsheet of just words and documents. And instead, with the breakthroughs that started at Google, we're now putting language into a sublime 768 dimensional vector space, which, though certainly not able to capture all of language, gets a bit closer with really powerful impact. So here I'm showing you is just the very Spartan UI that we have for something called parallel search, developed and led by my colleague, Javed Quadradin, which basically took the same fundamental techniques that were developed at Google and applied them into the common law. So essentially a neural net trained on the common law, pre-trained on the common law, fine-tuned for the ability to help lawyers find case law that they were looking for. And so what it led to was things like this. First, your query is no longer a Boolean query or something you're writing just for the search engine. The queries can now be complete sentences containing the arguments. They can be exactly what you would write to the judge. And indeed, our design of this was supposed to be set up so that you could just copy from a brief or from your memo, etc., and put in a complete sentence. And then, amazingly, the technology is able to find you relevant case law even when the words are completely different. And that's really this absolute breakthrough. You were able to find, for instance, my search here was about an employee's refusal to wear a mask and whether that could be construed as discriminatory, the fact that they were terminated. And you'll see things like, refusal to wear a uniform sweater or jacket because of her race. Here, I think the item is a hard hat was the safety item that the employee wouldn't wear. And instead of termination, it was adverse employment action. Here it has to do with improper brazing glasses. And what you see here, of course, is that you couldn't come up in your mind with every type of safety equipment that may or may not have been worn, right? It really takes something like this technology to be able to retrieve these automatically. Once you see them, it's quite easy for us as humans to understand that these are the same concepts. But prior to these breakthroughs with transformer-based neural nets, BERT, as it's widely known, you just weren't able to do anything that even came close to this. So one of the great things about attorneys is they never stay too happy for long. So we released this. I have never seen anything like it in terms of the enthusiasm that attorneys showed for it. There are now thousands and thousands of attorneys using it every day, from the skyscrapers of Manhattan, AmLaw firms, to the strip malls of Pasadena, Solos. Not surprisingly, litigators took very well to the ability to search with complete sentences and find relevant things, even if the wording didn't line up at all. But that happiness quickly became accompanied by an unhappiness that they could only use this technology when navigating the case law. As any of the litigators in the virtual audience know, there are a number of oceans of content that lawyers have to wade through, a number of species of content that you have to go through, of which case law is only one. And surely the benefits of being able to search like this would be realized if you could point it at other things. So the first thing we tried was, okay, well, what about e-discovery? That's a well-known world, and the Enron scandal was such a public affair that they actually released all of the actual emails from the Enron litigation to the public. So whenever you want to show off something in the context of e-discovery, you sort of use the Enron corpus to show it off. And so here, what I show you now is the same basic technology pointed not at case law, but at a database of real emails sent by employees. And I search, I feel uneasy about this. And again, you see that almost eerie ability of the algorithm to find things that are conceptual matches, even when the words are completely different, right? I'm worried, scared, I have a bad feeling, this is disturbing. Again, trivial for us as humans to line these up. Prior to this ability to map language in this much richer way, absolutely impossible for a machine to do it. And good luck coming up with every single one of these when trying to do a Boolean query. So we tried it with e-discovery. We put it in the hands of some attorneys for e-discovery. They were loving it. They're starting to refer to their old techniques as brute force, which is never, no one ever likes to be called that. But truly, compared to this sort of concept matching, the old ways do have this sort of sense of having to like really hack through in a much more laborious and inelegant way. But the requests kept coming. We want this technology for expert reports. We want this technology for transcripts, right? I've been a litigator for 20 years. I've litigated everything under the sun. Point this technology at my briefs that I've written so that I can quickly find, precedent that I relied on. And so we realized what we really needed to create, and this is getting to sort of the disposable yellow pad kind of thing, is a way to make it as easy to set up a neural net as it is to grab from your drawer a yellow legal pad. And that's really the heart of WeSearch. What WeSearch lets you do is simply name a search engine, drag and drop a folder with all the files in, and then it takes you to a UI that looks like this. In this case, the folder I dragged in was 500 President Obama's speeches. And then you can search it. Here I searched America was built on innovation. He didn't use those exact words, but he did say innovation is what America has always been about. And then you can click on the text in the full document. Some of the special sauce we had to work on was helping this to scale. One of the evolutionary pressures on case text, because we work with a full case database, is that we need to make this technology scale and be performant, and not take forever. But this now, to my mind, is the fastest way for litigators to quickly start to realize the power of transformer-based neural nets, either in the context of legal research with parallel search, or in the context of whatever they want with WeSearch. It's a very new product. It's only been out really for a few weeks. Already we've seen attorneys using it, again, from firms big and small, on written discovery, on contracts, on expert reports, as I mentioned, FOIA request productions. We've been amazed at just how many uses people come up with when it's really easy to spin up technology like this. And so if I could say anything to my legal profession, it's, get thee to the 768 dimensional vector space, because it is a much better place to exist than what you've known before. And hopefully tools like this, and I'm certain there will be other folks working in the same vein, will help you get there in a way that's efficient, effortless, and doesn't require you to get any PhD or take any coding classes. All right. Thank you.
Pablo, that was phenomenal. Congratulations on pulling that all with your team together. It's quite something to put that kind of power at the hands of legal professionals. Yeah, and I'm sure everybody now wants to get to that 768th dimensional vector space with you. One quick question from the audience that we've got up there. Are there any other good corpora out there besides the old Enron data for your application? I mean, I'm guessing this, obviously you're talking about everybody's own corpora of documents, but I'm guessing that this question is more in terms of the broad-based learning that you've been doing, or how might you respond to that?
Well, yeah, I think look around and ask yourself, what am I searching through? Is it encoded in a dismal, flat keyword index when it might be encoded in this richer format? And then try it. Anyone can go to wesearch.ai. Forgive again, kind of Spartan UI at this moment. And for 7 days, immediately try this. Just spin it up, throw documents in, and you'll see for yourself which use cases make sense and which ones perhaps maybe it's not as valuable. But really, it's designed to work quickly with anything. I will say sometimes we've had some attorneys that are working on like a very domain specific thing like pharmaceutical litigation, something like that. At times like that, training the neural net specifically on that corpora can have an added benefit. But the ones that we offer right now, both legal and general, work for the vast majority of cases.
Well, thank you again, Pablo. I mean, you've got such a broad area of potential application for this across, as you're saying, all of those different specialist areas. And best of luck to you. We're really looking forward to seeing where it goes next.
Thank you. And let me just say, if there is anyone from Google watching and you do see Mr. Devlin, please shake his hand on my behalf and give a bravo man, because truly we are really carrying forth the momentum that he started with that work.
Thanks again, Pablo. And so now I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Leila Banijamali is a Codex Fellow and the co-founder and CEO of Symbiom Corp, which she launched in 2018 with her Stanford co-founders. The company is fundamentally disrupting how complex planning regulations are consumed by the public and creating intuitive web applications from complex laws and regulations to make it easy for anyone to understand what's possible on a particular piece of property. Prior to launching Symbiom, Leila founded businesses in the tech media industries in addition to acting as outside general counsel to hundreds of tech companies. Leila, I remember when we met 10 years ago, back when I was on the team at StudX, and I can personally attest to the community here, to your forward-thinking approaches at the intersection of law and entrepreneurship. And so it's wonderful to see you continuing that entrepreneurship journey, and even more wonderful to see you doing it in computational law. Thank you for joining us to share your learnings in your current work around government relations management and how we might get to that ideal world where control over data finds its way into the hands of the public. Thanks, we hope, to computational law. Welcome, Leila.
Thanks, Tony. And the feeling is mutual. You are truly a class act, so I'm happy to be here. So first of all, so my name, like Tony said, is Leila Banijamali. I'm the CEO, and alongside Michael Genezareth and Abhijit Mahapatra, I'm one of the co-founders of Symbiom. So I'd like to do two things. The first is I'm going to illustrate the current state of the public's transactional relationship with governments and the myriad of ensuing challenges. And I can't stress this enough. The government ecosystem today is badly broken. The data is fragmented. It's largely inaccessible. It's hard to understand. We don't know what the government knows about us. We're effectively powerless to fix any errors. We don't know what we're allowed to do and what we're required to do, two very different things. And I'd like to remind folks, maybe some people remember my talk from last year at FutureLaw, where our company was initially embarking on a comp law app covering all of California, the residential properties in California. And we realized that there's a huge data problem, but that's just the beginning of it. So this lack of transparency and control around where you go, who you seek help from, what are the next steps, and how does the law apply to my particular situation, all form the universe of problems that we're interested in at Symbiom. So let me give you an example of this. In the case of real estate, as a homeowner, if I want to build a deck to update the information about my property, to change the appraisal value for property tax purposes, how do I do these things? So three options. I can look it up myself. It requires knowing where to look, of course, reading through the regulations manually and all associated amendments, cross-references, all of the updates. This is often a highly prohibitive task, and even for professionals, it's prohibitive, which most people are not. Second option is I can call the local government office, or I can walk in, I guess pre-pandemic times, to talk at the counter. But government office is slow to respond. They're totally under-resourced, especially in pandemic times when all of the resources have been diverted to emergency response. And I'll likely receive a different response depending on which government staff I speak with. Or the third option, so first, look it up myself, call a local government office. Third, hire an expensive consultant to do the work for me, which entails many of the same problems I already mentioned, with the added inconvenience of time and money lost. So in each of those cases, I feel like I have no control and I'm still in the dark. And this is an iterative process that happens over a long period of time. And so one misstep can be costly and time consuming. So this leads to what one of my co-founders calls a chain of misery, where multiple parties are adversely affected. So one thing we've seen in our work so far is oftentimes when developers or homeowners are, for example, doing a project on their property, a construction project, they'll planner shop at the counter, selecting the planners that they know will be most favorable to their projects. Or they'll talk to one planner, get a response from planner A that's totally different from the response from planner B. So there's friction at the counter. That friction often trickles up to the planning manager, to the planning director, and so on and so forth. So you have multiple parties brought into the loop here. But what's the worst part of all this? The worst part of all this is the lack of knowing, because you're effectively powerless unless you have some idea of what's the current state of affairs, what's required, what's the history, what's allowed, possibly in relation to this particular property, in relation to my particular situation. In other words, I want to see future hypotheticals, and that's where Symbiom's work in comp law has come into play. And then, of course, where do I start? Tell me where I start. So what's most broken, I think the common thread between everything is the user experience. So now that we understand the universe of problems, we can begin to innovate on what the experience should be, or the ideal world. And the ideal world is my second point. This is what Symbiom is working towards. So the ideal user experience is a citizen dashboard that will completely transform your expectations of how you interact with government and what you can accomplish. So it puts the feasibility and the transaction control back into the hands of the public. And it has three essential components. The first is integrated data. So we have unified data about me, compiled, complete, and clean from multiple different sources, all in one place. So I'll give you an example. During the pandemic, my condo in downtown San Francisco decreased in value, while many spacious single-family homes with nice yards right outside the city increased in value. Fine. The assessor may have incorrect data about my home value, incorrect square footage, which is in multiple different places, not just in the assessor's office, and a delayed permit. And because of these other issues, I won't be able to know and correct that data on my own terms and on my, because of these and the other issues, I won't be able to pay the right property taxes. And where I want to be able to correct that data on my own terms and on my own time. So the data that's in the government hands, whether or not it's correct, is the only data upon which the government is basing its decisions. So we must make sure that it's correct and in sync with multiple different data buckets. Too much square footage here, high assessor values there could cost me more in property taxes than I ought to be paying. So that's the first thing, is the integrated data. The second essential component is integrated services, power to update that data and for that update to be propagated to multiple different parties. Example, also last year, I changed my homes. So as a consequence of this, for every service that I was using, whether it's government for tax purposes, all of my credit card information, my driver's licenses, I have to manually update that in multiple different portals. You have to type in the exact same information in 20 different places because there's no common service layer. And then the third component is search. We've talked about it. Pablo mentioned it. Amélie-Sophie mentioned it. You know, Wikipedia, I should be able to find information and answers, not links and documents. I just want the answers. So search engines and, for example, Wikipedia are very useful for finding information in a simple query. But what if I want to search for the list of all members of Congress who've been convicted of a crime, or all senators who have a DUI. When you want more specific information or many layers of data that relate to each other, and if you have a specific information need, you won't find it in one place. You have to go to multiple sites and perform a mental synthesis to understand what's truly going on. So with all of that, in the past 2 years, we've helped homeowners, developers, nonprofits, cities manage and view what's possible in the built environment, whether it's adding a second unit to a property or setting up any type of business like a grocery store or a bookstore, a health clinic. We've employed comp law to help people understand how local and state regulations apply to a specific property. What does the law tell me about what I can do? And let's perform this feasibility analysis with hypotheticals. Now let's come full circle to the user experience problem. The solution is the Citizens Dashboard, which is what our team is making a reality. This is the one place that anyone can visit where feasibility and transaction control are back in the hands of the public, and we've already made significant headway. These are the important problems we're working on at Symbium, and this is the future of government relationship management. My name is Leila Banijamali. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Symbium. Thanks for having me. Back to you, Tony.
Leila, wow, what absolutely fascinating work you've been doing. And it's tremendous to hear you talk about feasibility and transaction control. Can you dig a little bit more into those notions? Because they roll off your tongue in a way that just sounds empowering. But take me through what that involves. What does feasibility involve? What does it mean to have transaction control?
Yeah, sure. So feasibility is just basically simply performing these hypotheticals, and comp law is actually perfectly suited. We call ourselves the comp law company, right? We're creating these apps. We have been creating these apps that are perfectly suited to allow anyone to understand, what's possible. In other words, I have a piece of property. I want to know what I can build, where exactly can build, all the detailed development standards. I don't want to learn it after I've applied with my permit at the planning counter. I want it on my own terms, on my own time, from the comfort of my living room, and I want to be able to see it visually. So that's what feasibility is all about, is performing these hypotheticals and empowering that citizen to be able to do that. And property is just one example. You can apply this across the board to any situation, across any vertical, financial services, insurance, the list goes on. Some of these issues people have already brought on topic today. Transaction control is about the data and taking action on that data. So I have a certain amount of data that the government has on me, actually. It's held in some government data buckets. And I noticed that some of that data is incorrect, but it's not clear to me how I actually go in and change that data. So the transaction there is taking some action on that data, whether it's requesting a reappraisal of my property, changing the square footage of my property. Something is wrong that I need to change, and I should be the one that has complete visibility and transparency on how to do it.
Thank you for that. And next question, just you mentioned integrated data. Now, this is, I think, something of a holy grail in this broader area of data governance where data in a way that is shareable and usable in these different situations, but having that in the control of the user. What are some of the ways you're seeing as the most promising to integrate data?
Sorry, I think you cut out for me. Do you mind repeating the question?
Essentially, what are some of the ways you're seeing as most promising to integrate data?
Yeah, so I think one of the major ways is through forms, right? Forms are a major way where information is collected. So forms anywhere on the web, we use forms on a daily basis. Anytime we enter in some information, that's where the data is entering from the web. So I think that, from a simplicity perspective, I would say forms is one major way of that entry point.
Fantastic. And then do you think you'll be working with any data intermediaries in ways where they're sort of, as you're saying, compiling from multiple sources? Is the company itself looking to become a data intermediary in that kind of way?
I definitely see a future where that's happening, and I've definitely seen a situation where these data layers are because they're so fragmented, where city governments that are already partners of ours have asked us for help with it. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done there still.
Well, between you and Stephen and the many other amazing people in this ecosystem, like driving for ethical approaches to data, I think we're in pretty decent hands, but the community always needs more. And so thank you for inspiring more people to understand and hopefully get involved. Leila, always a pleasure.
Thanks, Tony.
And so thank you to all of our speakers for a terrifically informative and inspiring set of LEX talks. Roland, back to you.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you to you for astutely moderating this session of LEX Talks. So we're right on time. It's 10 after 3. We'll take a short break until 3:20 when we'll have our closing panel on the importance of Professor Rodi's work for the future of regulation of the legal profession. So, so let's all reconvene at 3:20 for our closing panel. All right, so see you in a bit.